Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
I believe a few days ago you asked about the ideal type business, and were you just trying to get it on the table, or were you really critical of the notion of the ideal type of a dying and rising God?
No, I was actually just getting it on the table.
That's what I figured.
Because I'd had a discussion with Chris Hansen where he came at me pretty hard with all of that. I understand, I think, to a degree what he and other scholars are trying to say, and that it does subsume a whole range of data or phenomena under a single category, and can, I suppose, ignore some distinctions and differences in so doing. But again, as I understood it, and as you've pretty well addressed, the whole notion, the ideal type is admittedly an artificial construct.
That's right.
that is for the sake of classification and saying, no, we're not saying all of these things are exactly the same, that they're all identical, but that there is a legitimate point of comparison, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's even more remarkable than if it was. It's kind of like the apologists say, if the Gospels all agreed, you'd have to wonder if the writers were collaborating or something, or to put it in a less pejorative way, that they were simply copying a common story. And that's kind of what Crossan and others argue, that everything seems to go back to one original, the Gospel of Mark. But here it would be so amazing if they agreed all down the line. It'd raise a whole different set of questions. Like, you'd have to ask, well, these things must have been a single religion that had slight differences, but that's it. But that's not what anybody thinks. That's not the point of an ideal type, whether you're making an ideal type of the dying and rising God or of communism or anything else. You would say, I mean, I've got a friend who's a radical commie who is a member of the Progressive Labor Party, and they think Karl Marx was too conservative. They're still commies, but they're of a different stripe than the Spartacist League and the Trotskyites and so forth. So you don't say, nobody says all the communists are exactly the same. No. So yeah, I suspected you were just saying, yeah, let's get that out in the open and see what to make of it.
Yeah, and it strikes me that the ideal type is merely saying that these things are comparable or that they are analogous, which I think is oftentimes the least we can say. But the most we can say is that there might be some kind of genealogical relation, which you can't necessarily prove. But it seems to me that if you're arguing that, well, no, these come from different or disparate cultures and originated in different contexts and meant different things, or within those contexts, it seems to me you still can't necessarily make a case against some type of borrowing or genealogical link, because there was so much rampant syncretism during that day and age. There was so much cultural crossbreeding that it seems to me that even if these things did originate in different cultures under different contexts, various cultures were adopting and adapting various motifs from the other cultures to suit their own cultural or sociological needs. Am I mistaken, or is that?
No, there's all sorts of evidence of that. For instance, there's an elaborate sarcophagus from the early centuries CE. I forget exactly where. I think it's from North Africa, and it was Jewish guy's coffin, and there were all kinds of carvings in it, and one was I think the menorah, and then there was the wheel of Attis, one of the dying and resurrecting mystery religion gods. And what is going on there? I mean, it's not like one of these coexist bumper stickers. It shows a kind of divided religious allegiance. That the kind of thing I believe that's what the discussion of the weaker brethren and the food offered to idols in 1 Corinthians is about. What is it that Paul or whoever is afraid is going to happen if the weaker brother sees you, who knows better, going into an idol temple for a banquet where the meat comes from the altar. They had too much meat sacrificed and would sell it in the marketplace or whatever. What is it he's afraid of that the weaker brother is going to see and infer? Well, I think it's that the weaker brother is going to say, what the heck? Look, there goes Derreck into the temple of Apollo or something. Well, I used to worship a few of these gods. I guess I still can. Whereas the prevalent Christian view is, no, that's over. If you want to be baptized with Jesus, you got to quit all the other ones, which that did prevail, but not everybody saw it, and I think that's what he's afraid of. He says, no, don't give him that idea. You're right. You just go into the steakhouse. There's nothing spooky about it. You know these gods don't really exist, but he doesn't necessarily. Don't make him think that he was right and he's going to go back to being half pagan. And that was the danger. And we know people would get initiated into as many mystery cults as they could afford to do. Yeah, there was all kinds of borrowing, even of trivial stuff. In fact, Attis is shown wearing a Persian cap, a distinctive, silly-looking headpiece, and he must have gotten it from Mithras. People were so used to drawing or painting or sculpting Mithras with this thing, they figured, well, we don't want Attis to fall behind in the latest fashion, so he gets one too. And that's trivial, but that almost implies if they could do that, there must have been more important things. And various authors said Dionysus and Osiris, they have to be the same god. They just go under different names. And of course, there were also Hellenistic Jews, like whoever wrote the Epistle of Aristeas. He says, you call him Zeus, we call him Jehovah. What's the difference? What? It's just the whole Sabazius religion is based on that. It's like when Christians and Muslims say, we don't really worship different gods. You got the same stories and all that, and of course that is historically correct. But it seemed the same way to the ancients. So syncretism was no shocking thing.
Awesome. When it comes to mythicism, I am on the fence, strangely enough. I've gone back and forth. I've even written, mythicist blogs and so forth. But then, I'll come across some new argument or something I haven't considered before, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I need to reassess here. So I've got some questions for you that I want to challenge you with. I don't have a dog in this race, but I just want to, let's start with Josephus and the Testimonium Flavianum. You and others have noted that if you peel away the extraneous stuff, the sort of dubious kinds of things that we know Josephus wouldn't have said, you're left with this little kernel of a brief mention of Jesus that seems strangely out of context, sandwiched as it is between these two Jewish calamities that he's describing. So that would seem to suggest that really the whole thing is better just described as a forgery. But others have pointed out that, well, no, not necessarily, because sometimes Josephus will make these sort of brief excursions where he kind of goes off the rails for just a moment and then comes back to what he had been previously speaking about. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it possible that that was just a brief excursion, or is it better described as just a complete forgery?
The latter, though that isn't a big argument for me. I mean, it is important, and I think they're probably right. We often find that in the Pauline epistles that something is so out of place that it looks like this has to be an interpolation, though usually there are linguistic arguments there too. That J.C. O'Neill would point this out in the case of Galatians and Romans, that what is this doing here? And come to think of it, in Galatians, it refers to Paul's contemporaries in Judaism, and he says that's anachronistic. That assumes the later discussion of Judaism versus paganism and so on. And it uses the brief passage uses words that are never found elsewhere in Paul, and so usually there's a few of these things. Winsome Monroe points this out. That it's going on all over the Pauline epistles and First Peter, and says that you can tell from the context and all this stuff that there's been an attempt to sanitize Paul's letters in a Catholic direction, and with the same agenda as whoever wrote the pastoral epistles, to make Paul safe for Catholicism. Well, so that does have some weight with me, but the thing that really kills it is that nobody knows of this thing before Eusebius in the 4th century, and where he mentions it, it just happens to, even in the short compass of it, it happens to refer to points Eusebius is making about Jesus in a debate with pagans. Like when he says, wise man, if you can even call him a man. Well, this fits in the context of Eusebius, maybe not Josephus, but Eusebius, who is trying to show that Jesus was no mere man, and so on and so forth. And the whole thing, it's like a checklist. It's as if this was fabricated to proof text his argument, and this wouldn't be the only time Josephus did this. He probably created the phony correspondence between Jesus and King Abgar of Edessa, and though he says he found it in the archives, the same guy in his preparation for the gospel admits that it's okay to lie for the sake of the capital T truth. So it just seems to me that's a killer, but just as bad. The sentence structure is different in this passage from what it is in the adjacent Pilate paragraphs, where the calamities brought on the Jews include the repressive tactics of Pilate, and he goes into this one, the aqueduct thing and the Roman standards and so on. Well, I forget who it was that pointed this out, I've written about it. In all the other ones, Pilate is the star, and so he is the subject of the sentence. It's about Pilate. This passage in Josephus is not about Pilate, but he's mentioned in it. So when somebody read it in Eusebius, they figured, oh, well, this must be where it was originally in Josephus. It isn't in my copy, but let's pencil it in. There, Pilate is mentioned only in a subordinate clause somewhere, and it's just like, why is this one suddenly sticking out like a sore thumb in terms of the literary structure? And you can go on and on with this. The whole notion that there was an earlier version that fits better with the theory that that would fit better with a theory that Josephus did mention Jesus, but didn't say he was the second person of the Trinity. Well, of course he didn't say that, but he was the Christ. He appeared to them again alive. The theory that, well, maybe that was added, but the whole thing was legit. It turns out that the instances of this, and there are about 3 of them in Syriac and Arabic, they appear to be translations and slight rewrites of the Eusebius text, not any earlier version of it. There are signs that whoever, Agapius and others, were getting this out of Eusebius because they couldn't have gotten it out of Josephus because it wasn't there. So it isn't an earlier, there's no reason to think it's an earlier version. And I just find it absolutely hilarious that scholars with a straight face will just omit the stuff that marks it as a Christian forgery and say, well, the rest of it's pretty safe, when they won't let you get away with doing that in the Gospels, where there's no textual, no manuscript evidence for an omission or something. And so critics say, yeah, this was an interpolation. They'll say, oh, we don't have any manuscripts that lack it. Yeah, that's probably because there aren't any manuscripts until about the year 200. But they abhor that. But here, yeah, let's make bad evidence into good evidence by redacting it. That's all they're doing. It's amazing to me the intellectual hypocrisy.
What about, and also, Derek, I can't see Bob. All I can see is your ugly mug. I
What?
don't see it. I don't want to see it.
I don't know how, bro. I'm sitting here.
I am furious.
Listen, at least you didn't turn to stone, okay? I'm not quite on the level of Medusa, so.
Is that a biblical reference? I've never read it.
It's somewhere in, in Heretic Titus 3, verse 15. Yeah.
I know that one.
Mrs.
Back
Lot.
to Josephus.
I'm sorry.
The James reference. One of the things that's been pointed out there, I know Carrier has pointed this out, is that strangely this whole business with Ananias never appears anywhere in the book of Acts, which is odd because Acts, as most of us know, relies pretty heavily on Josephus. So if, the whole business concerning Ananias there in Josephus really concerned our Jesus and James, shouldn't it be there in Acts? I'll let you take that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You could say that, Acts is certainly written after the death of Paul, though it never describes the death of Paul. So it could be that for some reason it just does not fit Luke's interest. I'd admit that, but I think other strange things are going on with James, and I won't get into this, but I hold the crazy theory that Silas is supposed to be James, that this is based on something in Robert Eisenman, though he doesn't say it and probably wouldn't want to be tarred with it, but he says that some of the the pre-Mohammedan prophets mentioned in the Quran are actually early Christian missionaries. That Hud, H-U-D in English, is actually Yehuda or Judas or Theudas, whom he identifies, and that Ad, just A-D, is supposed to be Adai or Thaddeus, and so forth. And I find it really fascinating and convincing, though it's, who knows. But he says that that Selah, or is it Salah, I forget, he doesn't say he's one of them, but he says that it's Arabic for the just or the righteous. And that makes me think that it's striking that we hear of James at the Council of Jerusalem in chapter 15, and immediately Paul and his new partner, Silas, after splitting with Barnabas, the two of them go around to the churches announcing the terms of the council's decree about the handful of laws that Gentile Christians should keep. And then we don't hear any more about Silas, but shortly thereafter, in chapter 20 or 21, Paul and the gang wind up in Palestine again, where they see James, who recalls what happened in chapter 15. I can't shake the suspicion that that Luke probably knew that James the just was Silas, the righteous, and that he accompanied Paul to make sure he got it right with the decree. And then once that's over, we can call him James again, because he's going to intrude into the story to reiterate what he said when he was last in the book as James. So whether he knew it or not, I suspect it was the same character. So there's a totally wacky theory that even Eisenman doesn't endorse, but I can't help thinking it's true. But yeah, why wouldn't he give that? He has James the... here's one other thing about that. Hans Joachim Scheps, another great Jewish New Testament scholar, had argued some decades before that James's death is in Acts. They just gave him the name Stephen because the story of his death is so similar to the one we find in Hegesippus and Eusebius and elsewhere. I think the Ascents of James, where he's thrown down from some elevated platform and stoned to death, and his brains are beaten out with a launderer's club and so forth. Hans Joachim Scheps said, come on, this has really got to be the James story. And Stephen just happens to mean crown, and so it's the crown of martyrdom. And Eisenman says, yeah, that's right. And so that even the death, the beheading of James the son of Zebedee was originally about James the just, but there is this less of a focus on him. Peter and Paul are the heroes, and so it's been slightly disguised. I think that's probably right. So in that case, James's death is mentioned.
Join our Patreon